Hey guys, so what I did for this video is survey the players in the White Forest Duelist groups both on Facebook and Discord just to get their thoughts on the key strengths, weaknesses, and much more about the deck because it is of course new post Infinite Forbidden. So huge thanks to the 78 players that responded to the survey. That's actually a really good turnout for these kind of surveys, so I'm really grateful for that, and you can certainly check me out on Twitter to not miss out on any future surveys. As always, definitely go check out my discount codes for Yu-Gi-Oh! Singles as well as supplies, links in description code below. So let's just get to the results, and I wanted to make sure that I tried my best to capture, what White Forest variant people are playing, or rather I should say engines, because they are not mutually exclusive. You can definitely check multiple boxes if it applied. Basically, it looks like the toy package was definitely most popular among a lot of the players. I know that it can create a lot of advantage for them. Centurion has been pretty popular with any kind of synchro strategy, really. Even like Vanadium, they would play like a small Centurion package, for example. Runic, I was actually kind of surprised. I thought this was actually the most common variant. I believe it is the one that topped as well, and really synergizes well with the White Forest stuff, being able to discard spell traps from hand or field. Fiendsmith, I mean, really, you can just slap down this on most decks, and I heard there were some Horus as well. In terms of other, there were some, like, let's say with like Millennia cards, or even like Bestial package as well. Those were some of the responses. Now, in terms of how the players would rate the difficulty of piloting White Forest, it came to around 6.6, a little bit on the lower end. I mean, if you look at the bottom left corner here, in terms of some of the comparisons with the deck that I've surveyed recently, you had something like Ritual Beast as high as 9+, considered very, very difficult to pilot. Yubel was like just under 7, and you had something like Tempai Dragons, which was very low at around 4, because it is kind of known to be pretty straightforward to play. So essentially, White Forest kind of falls in between Tempai and Yubel. Now, in terms of how the players would rate the consistency of White Forest, this was actually pretty low at 6.3, definitely much lower than any of the decks that I've surveyed that in terms of comparison that you see here, but also I've been doing this for about the past year with all the different meta relevant strategies we've had since then, and I think this is definitely still on the lower end as well, and we're going to get to that on the limitation section too. Now, in terms of what tier the players would categorize this deck as, more than half put it at tier 2, but a big chunk put it at rogue as well. This actually kind of falls in line with my most recent meta tier list by the data video I posted. It actually came at the very edge of tier 2. It did top the European WCQ, so you know what, there was some promise there, so keep that in mind. Now, in terms of the key strengths of this deck, I tried my best to summarize what the players thought. Card advantage with just like one card combos, if it resolves at least, they definitely mentioned that, especially also if you're playing like Runic version. Obviously, Runic stuff in general can lead to a lot of card advantage with just being able to draw multiple times. Calamity Lock, if you are playing this way, of course, not only are you probably just winning, but in general, it also helps you be resistant to board breakers, right? Because they're just not going to be able to play it, which tends to be kind of like a weakness, it seems, for sort of like the control Runic version of White Forest. In terms of the recursion and grind game recovery, that was considered to be a key strength of this deck. I mean, realistically, with like their White Forest synchro monsters, you can just like put them back with their effects in terms of the main deck monster effects, and then just bring them out again. So really, you have like infinite extra deck monster. In terms of spell trap resource recycling, that's also a very unique thing about White Forest too, right? Just being able to not only dump whatever spell trap from your hand or field, but then actually being able to add it back off like your synchro and everything. So I think that can lead to some pretty interesting gameplay as well. Now, in terms of the deck's ability to go first, they actually put it around 8.1 out of 10, which is honestly pretty solid. Again, you see some of the comparisons here. Yubel is considered to have a very strong turn 1 board, and Ritual Beast, of course, it was actually rated at 9 because their turn 1 board is more so just like straight up you can't play at all because it's like Protos or Colossus or whatever, right? Or even Shifter as well. Tempai, of course, that's not a going first deck, so that's not a good comparison, but nonetheless, I think if White Forest can go off, they can be very, very strong, especially when you have something like Calamity Lock if you do play it that way. In terms of being able to go second, this was considered to be a very key weakness for sure. I saw this in the comments as well, rated essentially 5 out of 10. And if you look at some of these other decks where even something like Ritual Beast, Yubel, they're still in the 6s. Tempai, obviously, it's a very good going second deck, so it's really high. But nonetheless, it seems like going second, especially with in-engine, is very, very big weakness for White Forest. Now, in terms of the typical end board that this deck can end on, this was actually pretty challenging, especially with so many different versions of White Forest that's out there. So I'm going to start with some of the ones that seems to be the most basic ones in archetype. And again, this is typical end board, not like the most optimal busted board. And then we'll talk about a little bit about other options as well. But for the most part, this came up a lot. The Diabell Synchro, as well as the Trap, the Woes, essentially allowing you to summon a Synchro monster on your opponent's turn. And what do you really summon? For example, the archetype one would be the Selvera, which can be essentially like a one-sided Book of Eclipse, or let's say, for example, you can also go into, it looks like they go into like Zapper Shrimp, which would be like a spell trap up, and then also synchro again into something like Chaos Angel, which of course is like a targeted banish, which can be very, very strong and also just serves a lot of interruptions on the opponent's turn. Now, of course, if you're going with the Calamity Lock version, well, you know what, you're probably just going to win if you can bring this out. And also, I think what's really scary is that if they can also get the Vanadium Reframing on top of that, which is an Omni Negate, but not only that, an actual counter trap, which essentially means you're just not going to be able to respond to this Calamity Lock, and you're just going to lose straight up, most likely. Now, of course, in terms of some of the other options, obviously, if you're playing like Fiendsmith stuff, that means you're going to have access to, like, let's say, I don't know, Appaloosa, like Desiree. Some players also mentioned about the new Silhouette Rabbit, the Link 2, which gets you to that Trap Angel statue, which essentially also can just like negate a special summon. So there are definitely other options. Obviously, if you're able to bring a Calamity, you also have a capacity to be able to bring out something like Quasar Dragon as well, in terms of, you know, something that you're going to see with like Centurion package basically. So there are definitely a lot of options with this deck. Now, in terms of the hand traps that are most impactful against White Forest, so essentially you can use this as kind of like a side decking guide against this strategy. And Dimension Shifter came out by far on the top, because the White Forest cards, they do have to be able to send to graveyard as cost in terms of the spell trap, and with Shifter you're just not going to be able to do that, so it really cripples them. And it's not really the best time, obviously, because of Snake Eye. You know, you want to play Shifter in a deck that, if it can play Shifter at least, so it kind of makes it hard. Droll, it seems like, is also very impactful against them as well, because the LZ, oddly enough, the effect to add after the summon is actually mandatory, which means you cannot special summon it, so that actually kind of hampers them quite a bit. Imperm, I mean, obviously these hand traps kind of fell off a lot more, but at the same time, something like the Stellar, it seems like they're very normal summon reliant, and that effect is actually surprisingly not on the summon, but you have to like sort of summon it first and then declare the effect. So Imperm, I mean, obviously even if it was on the summon, it's it wouldn't matter, but that being not on the summon is still kind of detrimental, because let's say you like destroy it as an opponent, and then you kind of don't have the chance to use the effect. Nibiru seem to be pretty impactful as well. Bestials, they are like pretty much all light and dark, so that can come up. And Bestials, of course, has been pretty popular lately, especially with like Fiendsmith stuff coming out. Purlia is, of course, a new addition now into these surveys because of it coming out in Infinite Forbidden. I guess they didn't rate it as high, but someone did mention that, you know what, your opponent could potentially draw like 4 cards still off of Purlia against this strategy as well. Next, in terms of board breakers, this one's a little bit challenging though, right? Because if you are playing the White Forest version where you're bringing out Calamity, then something like Evening Match, for example, wouldn't matter because your opponent's not going to be able to play it. And I think the results are a little bit hard to interpret in that sense, because, for example, let's say quick play spells like Forbidden Droplet, Super Poly, like Book of Eclipse, those, even Cosmic Cyclone, really, those would be good against things that are going against, or rather trying to make Calamity. Of course, if they have Reframing, then you're kind of screwed anyways, other than maybe Super Poly, I guess. But then, you know, you have something like Runic version, and in that case, something like Evening Match, like maybe even Feather Duster. Actually, no, not the Feather Duster or Lightning Storm, because they would have Hugin to, of course, protect against, you know, whatever destruction, but Evenly Match would still be pretty strong against the Runic version side of things. And then lastly, in terms of the Floodgates that are most impactful against White Forest, D-Barrier came on top. I mean, it is a synchro focus strategy, of course. Now, D-Barrier is just popular in general because of, let's say, like, you know, you have like Fiendsmith. You can actually call Fusion, like in terms of whatever decks that are playing that package can still be useful. You obviously have Branded, which isn't as popular. Even Voices has actually gone down and play a lot, but you still have Tenpai Dragons, which is kind of like the main reason for D-Barrier. There can be only one. All the White Forest monsters are spellcasters except for Diabel, which seems to be Illusion, so I'm sure it is strong. We've talked about Shifter-like effects, so obviously something like D-Fissure, Macrocosmos, it's going to be very strong. And you have something like, let's say, Skill Drain. It's funny because they actually are known to play Skill Drain themselves, because they can easily get rid of it, bring it back, and things like that. But it does look like if your opponent has Skill Drain, then it's going to be very hard for the White Forest players to kind of start off their plays. And funnily enough, of course, Synchro Zone is not going to affect them, which is kind of hard to say for a lot of decks out there outside of, you know, something like Tenpai too, of course, because Synchro Zone can be a pretty deadly Floodgate against a lot of different decks too. And lastly, in terms of the key weaknesses of this deck, there's some notable ones. We talked about the low consistency. The scores also reflect that as well. And it looks like there's just a lot of bricks that they would have to play, and it just doesn't really work out on a lot of times. And especially if you're playing the toy stuff, they were saying that if you don't draw it, then you really lose out on a lot of advantage. Initial commitment of resources. So for example, you have any kind of hand trap on like a Stellar or Elzat, whatever is applicable, then, you know, you kind of like neg 2 because you are pitching another spell and trap for that. So this is kind of similar to, let's say, when I surveyed like Pearly, for example, on the initial side of things, in their initial lines of play, they do lose some hand advantage quite a lot, and then they eventually get it back. And same thing, similar thing can be said for Branded Despia as well. So this can definitely be problematic. Graveyard reliance, of course, that means something like Shifter and the Macrocosmos like effects will be very strong against White Forest. Going second in general, we also talked about this in terms of the score, was right around 5 out of 10, very low. And then just like not enough negates, especially this was more so for the Runic version side of things, and just, you know, getting potentially blown out by something like Evenly. Alright guys, so that was it for the survey breakdown results of White Forest. Again, a huge thanks to those who did respond to the survey. Really appreciate your input. This video could not have happened without you guys, and I really look forward to surveying some of the other new strategies and more revamped strategies post Infinite Forbidden as I look to do more of these videos in the next couple months. So definitely a huge thanks to all of you for watching. Big thanks to my patrons and sponsors for the continued support, and well, take care guys.